Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. Daily Compliance News for February 25, 2022, the Swift or not to Swift edition. We begin with that story where we have a debate amongst U.S. allies around whether Russia should be cut off from the SWIFT payment banking system. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he's discussed banning SWIFT from the global payment system with the U.S. and is actively lobbying for that result. He believes it would be a very potent weapon. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, said that he is not ready to levy this severe sanction on Russia to cut them off from the global internet payment system, and that should not be a part of the second EU sanction against Russia. So we have an internal debate amongst U.S. allies over what's appropriate. Next up, from the Wall Street Journal, who's in your supply chain, but more importantly, who are your employees? And if companies operating in Russia and Ukraine began putting into place contingency plans as they confronted a host of challenges for employees who are working in those geographic areas. Executives began closing offices and factories, ensuring staff they were safe and sending some back to the Polish border. So if it's not just your supply chain or who's in your supply chain, it's where are your employees. And in the tech space, there are many companies that employ Russian and or Ukrainian employees. So they are having to deal with that issue. Finally, or not finally, but next, from the New York Times, could cryptocurrency help Russia if the U.S. bars Americans from doing business with Russian banks, oil and gas developers, and others? The global market for cryptocurrencies and other digital assets obviously has boomed, certainly in bad news for enforcers, as there's an open question about whether Russia will use cryptocurrency to take over from the role of traditional currencies, particularly if the U.S. Goes along with Boris Johnson and bans international banking transactions through the SWIFT banking payment system. And finally, probably should have begun with this article, but from the Washington Post, President Biden outlined another set of sanctions against Russia, saying that the aggression could not go unanswered. This amps up the amount of sanctions that were levied a little bit earlier this week. If you haven't begun to prepare your company for this, I would suggest you do so. Tomorrow, I'm releasing a special episode of the FCPA Compliance Report where with trade compliance expert Matt Silverman, in part 2 of a 2-part series, we look at what you can do to prepare your company. And now, since the sanctions have been levied, in part 1, we looked at the potential sanctions. So I've got a lot of information in the podcast. Matt really knows this stuff. And if you are in any type of compliance, it would be great for you and your company if you would check it out. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.